In the pre-dawn hours of January 18, 2026, as most of Britain slept peacefully in their beds, a lone figure moved silently through the corridors of Bagshot Park. The Duchess of Edinburgh, Sophie Wessex, stood at her bedroom window, watching the first pale light of winter creep across the frost-covered grounds. Her reflection in the glass showed a woman of 61 years, her face etched with the quiet determination that had defined her 24 years of royal service. In just a few hours, she would embark on one of the most significant days of her royal career, a day that would see her traverse from the industrial heart of Sheffield to the historic halls of Westminster, carrying with her the weight of history and the hopes of a nation still believing in the power of diplomacy and peace. The mobile phone on her dresser buzzed softly with the final confirmation she had been waiting for. The UN Secretary-General Antonio Guterres had arrived in London. The world's most important diplomatic gathering was about to commemorate 8 decades of international cooperation, and she, as King Charles's representative, would stand where history had first been made in 1946. But first, there was Sheffield, a city that had welcomed her with open arms just days before, where children with autism had shown her drawings of hope, where Olympic skating legends had shared their dreams, and where the very essence of British community spirit lived and breathed in every corner. As she prepared for what many would later call her most defining moment as a senior royal, Sophie couldn't know that this single day would reshape her public image from the spare royal to the secret weapon of the monarchy. She couldn't foresee that her journey between two vastly different worlds, the gritty authenticity of Yorkshire and the gilded diplomacy of Westminster, would capture the imagination of millions and remind the world what true royal service looked like in the 21st century. The frost was melting now, and, somewhere in the distance, she could hear the sound of her security detail preparing for departure. History was waiting, and the Duchess of Edinburgh was ready to meet it head-on. The steel city of Sheffield had always held a special place in Sophie's heart, though few knew the depth of that connection until that crisp January morning when she stepped out of the royal car onto the cobblestones of the city centre. The wind carried with it the familiar industrial scent that spoke of generations of hard-working families, of innovation forged in fire and determination. This wasn't her first visit to Sheffield, far from it, but today felt different, charged with an energy that seemed to pulse through the very air around her. Sophie's burgundy rice dress caught the weak winter sunlight as she made her way toward the Sparkle Sheffield Centre, a modest building that housed one of the most important charities in her patronage portfolio. The choice of venue wasn't accidental. Nothing in Sophie's carefully planned schedule ever was. Sparkle Sheffield supported children and young people with autism spectrum conditions and other social communication difficulties, and it represented everything she believed about the power of quiet, consistent service to transform lives. The charity's founder, Margaret Thompson, a fierce advocate in her 70s, greeted the Duchess at the entrance. Margaret had spent the better part of 4 decades working with children who struggled to find their voice in a world that often didn't understand them. Her weathered hands and gentle smile spoke of countless hours spent in patient conversation, of small victories celebrated and setbacks overcome with renewed determination. "Your Royal Highness," Margaret said, her Yorkshire accent warm and welcoming, "the children have been preparing for weeks. They've made something special for you." Inside the centre, the atmosphere buzzed with carefully contained excitement. 8-year-old Jamie sat in the corner, his fingers tracing patterns on a tablet screen, creating digital art that would have impressed gallery visitors twice his age. His autism meant that traditional conversation was challenging, but, through his art, Jamie could express emotions and ideas that left adults speechless with wonder. When Sophie approached, Jamie looked up briefly, their eyes meeting for just a moment before he returned to his screen. But, in that fleeting connection, something passed between them, an understanding that transcended words. "Jamie's been working on this for you," said his support worker, Sarah, as she showed Sophie the tablet. On the screen was a stunning digital painting of the United Nations building, its distinctive architecture rendered in swirling blues and whites that seemed to move and breathe with life. At the bottom, in careful letters, Jamie had written, "Peace starts with understanding." Sophie felt something catch in her throat. In a few hours, she would stand in Westminster, surrounded by diplomats and dignitaries, speaking about global cooperation and international understanding. But, here, in this quiet room in Sheffield, an 8-year-old boy had captured the essence of that message in a way that would stay with her long after the formal ceremonies ended. "It's beautiful, Jamie," she said softly, and, though the boy didn't look up, she could see the slight smile that tugged at the corners of his mouth. The tour continued through rooms where teenagers learned life skills, where young adults practiced job interviews, and where families found support and community. Each space told a story of patience, progress, and the profound impact of believing in someone's potential even when they couldn't see it themselves. Sophie listened to these stories with the attention they deserved, asking questions that revealed not just politeness but genuine understanding. In the main activity room, she joined a group therapy session where 5 teenagers were practicing social interactions through structured games. 17-year-old Emma, who had been selectively mute for most of her childhood, surprised everyone by speaking directly to the Duchess. "Do you ever get nervous when you meet new people?" Emma asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Sophie considered the question seriously before answering. "Every time," she said. "But I've learned that most people are just as nervous as I am, and when we admit that to ourselves, it becomes easier to be kind to each other." Emma nodded thoughtfully, and, later, Margaret would tell Sophie that it was the longest conversation Emma had initiated with a stranger in over a year. As the morning progressed, Sophie found herself drawn into the rhythm of the center's daily life. She helped organize art supplies, sat quietly beside children who weren't ready for interaction, and listened to staff members share the challenges and triumphs of their work. This wasn't the choreographed perfection of many royal visits, it was raw, real, and utterly authentic. The center's newest initiative particularly captured her attention, a program that paired children with autism with elderly residents from local care homes. The intergenerational friendships that had formed were unexpected and profound. 78-year-old Harold, a former steelworker, had become unlikely best friends with 12-year-old Marcus, who was fascinated by trains. Harold's stories of Sheffield's industrial heritage provided the perfect context for Marcus's encyclopedic knowledge of locomotive engineering, creating conversations that delighted both generations. "Marcus taught me about train schedules from the 1960s that I'd completely forgotten," Harold explained to Sophie as Marcus sat beside him, carefully organizing a collection of model trains. "And I've been telling him about the old steelworks, about how this city was built on the backs of working people who never gave up." The Duchess watched as Marcus carefully placed a small locomotive on the track, his concentration absolute. When the train completed its circuit, Harold applauded softly, and Marcus's face lit up with pride. It was a small moment, but it encapsulated everything Sophie had come to understand about the power of connection across differences. As her visit to Sparkle Sheffield drew to a close, the children presented her with a handmade book containing drawings and messages from every young person in the program. The cover, painted by Jamie, showed the same UN building from his tablet, but now surrounded by children holding hands around the globe. Inside, each page told a different story of friendship, of growth, of hope persisting in the face of challenge. "We wanted you to take something with you to London," explained 15-year-old Connor, who rarely spoke in group settings but had volunteered to make the presentation. "To remind the important people that we're here too, and we matter." Sophie held the book carefully, understanding its weight beyond the physical. "This will sit on my desk," she promised, "and every time I look at it, I'll remember that the most important diplomacy happens in places exactly like this, between people exactly like you." The wind had picked up by the time she emerged from the center, but the cold couldn't diminish the warmth that had settled in her chest. Sheffield had given her something precious, a reminder of why her work mattered, of whom it ultimately served. As she walked toward the car that would take her to her next engagement, she carried with her not just a handmade book but a renewed sense of purpose that would guide her through everything that lay ahead. The Steel City had worked its magic once again, tempering her resolve like the finest blade, preparing her for the diplomatic forges that awaited in Westminster. But, first, there was one more stop in Sheffield, one that would connect the industrial heritage of the North with the international stage she was about to enter. The Utilita Arena rose before Sophie like a cathedral of sport, its modern glass and steel facade reflecting the pale winter sky. The ISU European Figure Skating Championships had transformed Sheffield into a temporary capital of winter sports, drawing athletes, coaches, and spectators from across the continent. As the Duchess approached the arena, she could hear the distant sound of blades cutting ice, a rhythmic whisper that spoke of dreams carved in frozen water and perfection pursued through countless hours of practice. Prince Edward had arrived earlier that morning, his engagement with the skating championship representing the kind of sports diplomacy that the royal family had perfected over generations. But Sophie's arrival transformed the atmosphere from formal courtesy to genuine excitement. Word had spread through the skating community that the Duchess would be joining the gathering, and the anticipation was palpable. The arena's interior buzzed with controlled energy. Athletes warmed up in designated areas, their movements fluid and precise, while coaches watched with the intensity of generals planning battle strategies. The ice itself gleamed under the professional lighting, a perfect canvas for the artistry that would unfold over the coming days. But today, before the official competition began, the focus was on celebration of sport, of international cooperation, and of the unifying power of athletic excellence. Sophie's first stop was the VIP reception area, where she would meet with Team GB athletes competing in the championships. The British skating team was small but determined, representing years of training in facilities that couldn't match the resources of their international competitors. Yet their passion and dedication shone through in every conversation, every gesture, every carefully practiced routine. Emily Harrison, a 19-year-old pairs skater from Newcastle, practically glowed as she met the Duchess. Her partner, James Morton, stood beside her with the kind of quiet confidence that came from absolute trust in another person's abilities. Together, they had climbed the ranks of British skating despite training at dawn before school and holding part-time jobs to fund their competitive careers. "We've been dreaming of this moment for 3 years," Emily explained, her hands moving expressively as she spoke. "European Championships in Sheffield, it doesn't get more perfect than this for British skaters." Sophie listened intently as Emily described their journey, from local ice rinks in the northeast to the elite training centers that had shaped their partnership. The financial sacrifices, the physical demands, the emotional investment, it all poured out in a rush of words that revealed not just athletic ambition but deep love for their sport. "What draws you to pairs skating specifically?" Sophie asked, genuine curiosity coloring her voice. James answered thoughtfully, "It's the trust, Your Royal Highness. When you're lifting someone 12 feet in the air, or when you're spinning and have to trust they'll be exactly where they need to be, it's like nothing else in the world. You have to believe completely in another person." The Duchess nodded, understanding flowing between them. In her own life, she had learned the importance of trust, of partnerships built on mutual respect and shared purpose. The parallel between skating partnerships and the diplomatic relationships she would encounter later that day wasn't lost on her. Her meeting with Christopher Dean brought an entirely different energy to the afternoon. The Olympic legend, now in his 60s but still carrying himself with the grace that had made him a global icon, greeted Sophie with the warmth of an old friend. Though they had met several times over the years, each encounter revealed new layers of his remarkable journey from a police constable in Nottingham to the pinnacle of athletic achievement. "Sheffield has always been special to us," Dean explained as they walked toward the rink where he would provide commentary for the championships. "It was here that Jane and I performed some of our most important early routines. The audience here understands skating, they appreciate the artistry as much as the athletics." Sophie had vivid memories of watching Torville and Dean's legendary performances, particularly their 1984 Olympic routine to Bolero that had redefined what ice dancing could be. To stand beside Dean in this arena, surrounded by the next generation of skaters pursuing their own moments of transcendence, felt like witnessing the eternal cycle of sporting excellence. "What advice do you give to these young skaters?" she asked as they watched Emily and James run through portions of their routine on the practice ice. Dean's expression grew thoughtful. "I tell them that the ice will teach them everything they need to know about discipline, about partnership, about recovering from falls. But, most importantly, it will teach them that perfection isn't about never making mistakes. It's about making mistakes beautifully, with such commitment and artistry that the audience shares in your journey rather than judging your stumbles." The wisdom in his words resonated deeply with Sophie, who had faced her own share of public scrutiny and private challenges throughout her royal career. The parallel between performing on ice and performing royal duties struck her as profound. Both required grace under pressure, the ability to make recovery look effortless, and the courage to be vulnerable in front of crowds. As they moved to the main arena, Sophie was struck by the international nature of the gathering. Russian skaters practiced alongside Ukrainian athletes, their shared dedication to sport transcending the political tensions that dominated headlines. Georgian pairs skaters worked through their routines near German ice dancers, while coaches from dozens of countries shared technical insights and mutual encouragement. This is what sport does best, Dean observed, noticing her attention to the international mix. It reminds us that we're all human beings pursuing excellence, regardless of where we're from or what languages we speak. The observation would stay with Sophie as she prepared for her Westminster engagement, where diplomats would gather to celebrate 8 decades of international cooperation. The arena provided a perfect metaphor for what the United Nations aspired to achieve: diverse peoples coming together in pursuit of shared goals, competing fiercely but fairly, celebrating each other's achievements while striving for their own. Prince Edward found them during a break in the practice sessions, his conversation with other skating officials having provided insights into the championship's broader significance. The European Figure Skating Championships weren't just about medals and rankings, they served as a crucial preparation ground for the upcoming Winter Olympics in Italy, making Sheffield a temporary crossroads of international athletic diplomacy. The Georgians are particularly impressive this year, Edward shared, referencing the skaters who had been dominating the men's competition in early sessions. Their technical precision is extraordinary, but they skate with such joy. You can see how much they love what they're doing. Sophie watched the Georgian skater he had referenced, Mikhail Kokia, a 22-year-old whose performances seemed to defy gravity. His practice jumps looked effortless, but she could see the years of training that made such apparent ease possible. Every muscle movement was controlled, every landing calculated, every artistic gesture deliberately chosen to enhance the overall performance. The afternoon's highlight came when Christopher Dean invited Sophie onto the ice itself. With skating guards protecting the arena's surface, she carefully made her way to center ice, where the championship competitions would unfold over the coming days. The perspective from the skater's position was entirely different. The arena seats seemed to tower above, creating an intimate yet vast space where athletic dreams would be realized or deferred. "This is where it all happens," Dean said softly. "Every skater who steps onto this ice carries with them years of preparation, sacrifice, and hope. Some will achieve their dreams here, others will use this experience to fuel their next attempt. But all of them will leave knowing they gave everything they had." Standing on that ice, Sophie felt the weight of expectation and possibility that every performer, whether athlete or royal, carried into public spaces. The arena would soon fill with thousands of spectators, each bringing their own hopes and expectations to the experience. The skaters would transform this frozen surface into a stage for human drama, artistic expression, and athletic achievement. As her arena visit concluded, Sophie carried with her a deep appreciation for the international community that sport fostered. The lessons learned here about preparation, partnership, grace under pressure, and the beauty of striving for perfection while accepting inevitable imperfection would inform her approach to the diplomatic challenges awaiting in Westminster. The children's book from Sparkle Sheffield remained carefully tucked in her briefcase, while the inspiration from the skating arena filled her thoughts. Two very different Sheffield experiences had prepared her for London in ways she hadn't anticipated, grounding her upcoming diplomatic role in authentic human connections and genuine artistic excellence. The journey to Westminster beckoned, but Sheffield had given her gifts that would enhance everything that followed. The train to London cut through the English countryside with mechanical precision, its rhythmic movement providing a meditative backdrop to Sophie's preparation for the afternoon ceremony. The first-class compartment had been cleared for the royal party, but she found herself drawn repeatedly to the window, watching the landscape transform from Yorkshire's industrial heritage to the rolling fields that eventually gave way to London's endless suburban sprawl. In her briefcase lay the handmade book from the Sparkle Sheffield children, its colorful cover a stark contrast to the formal documents that surrounded it: briefing papers on UN history, diplomatic protocols, and the carefully scripted remarks she would deliver at Westminster. But it was the children's book that she returned to repeatedly during the journey, its simple messages of hope and connection providing clarity that no amount of official preparation could match. Her private secretary, Amanda Richardson, sat across from her reviewing the afternoon's timeline with military precision. Amanda had served the royal family for over 15 years, her Scottish efficiency tempered by an intuitive understanding of when to speak and when to allow silence. She recognized the contemplative mood that had settled over the Duchess since leaving Sheffield, and she knew better than to interrupt unless absolutely necessary. The Secretary-General's delegation arrived at Heathrow this morning, Amanda reported during one of their brief planning discussions. His remarks will focus on the UN's evolution since 1946, with particular emphasis on current challenges in global cooperation. Sophie nodded, her thoughts already engaged with the weight of representing King Charles at such a significant moment. Antonio Guterres had led the United Nations through some of its most challenging periods, navigating international crises while maintaining faith in the organization's fundamental mission. To share the platform with him at Methodist Central Hall, the very venue where the UN had been born, felt both humbling and inspiring. The Methodist Central Hall, Westminster, held special significance that extended far beyond its role as the UN's birthplace. Built in 1912 as a monument to Methodist social action, the building had witnessed decades of political, social, and spiritual gatherings that shaped modern Britain. Its distinctive Edwardian Baroque architecture spoke of confidence and permanence, values that seemed particularly relevant as the world grappled with contemporary uncertainties. As the train approached London, Sophie's phone buzzed with updates from various sources. King Charles was monitoring the day's events from Windsor, where he was recovering from a minor cold that had prevented his own attendance. Prince William and Catherine were engaged in their own diplomatic mission in Scotland. The royal family's coordinated approach to international relations required careful choreography, ensuring that Britain's soft power was deployed effectively across multiple fronts. The media interest is substantial, Amanda noted, scrolling through news alerts on her tablet. Every major international outlet is covering the ceremony, and the domestic press has been particularly focused on your role representing His Majesty. The scrutiny didn't surprise Sophie, though it still required mental preparation. After more than 2 decades in royal service, she had learned to navigate public attention while maintaining focus on the substance of her work. Today's ceremony demanded both diplomatic precision and genuine emotional engagement, a balance that had become her signature approach to royal duties. The train's final approach to King's Cross Station provided spectacular views of London's evolving skyline. New developments rose alongside historic landmarks, creating a visual metaphor for the city's ability to honor its past while embracing its future. The site reminded Sophie of the United Nations itself, an organization rooted in post-war idealism but continually adapting to address contemporary challenges. Her preparation for the Westminster ceremony had included extensive research into the UN's founding moments in 1946. The original 51 member states had gathered in Methodist Central Hall with hopes that international cooperation could prevent the horrors of global conflict from recurring. 80 years later, those hopes remained largely unrealized, but the persistence of the effort itself represented a form of faith that Sophie found deeply moving. The royal car waited at King's Cross, its presence drawing modest attention from commuters who recognized the familiar sight of diplomatic transportation. Sophie's security detail had coordinated carefully with UN protocol officers to ensure seamless transitions throughout the afternoon. Every movement would be carefully choreographed, from her arrival at Westminster to her eventual departure after the ceremony's conclusion. During the drive through London's traffic, Sophie reviewed her remarks one final time. The speech had been crafted to honor the UN's achievements while acknowledging its ongoing challenges, striking a tone that was both celebratory and realistic. But she knew that the most important elements of her presentation would be the unscripted moments, the genuine connections with delegates, the authentic responses to unexpected situations, the human touches that transformed protocol into meaningful interaction. The Methodist Central Hall came into view as their car navigated Parliament Square's busy roundabout. The building's imposing facade commanded attention even among Westminster's architectural treasures, its position near Westminster Abbey and the Houses of Parliament emphasizing its historical significance. Today, it would serve as both theater and temple for a ceremony that celebrated humanity's persistent faith in collective action. Security barriers had transformed the surrounding area into a carefully controlled zone where diplomatic vehicles arrived in precise sequence. Representatives from the UN's 193 member states were gathering inside, their presence creating a living map of global diversity and shared commitment. The sight of so many national flags flanking the building's entrance provided a colorful reminder of the organization's ambitious scope. As Sophie's car approached the entrance, she could see the assembled media crews documenting every arrival. The ceremony would be broadcast globally, carrying her words and presence to audiences who would judge not just her performance but Britain's commitment to international cooperation. The responsibility felt particularly weighty given the current state of global affairs, where multilateral institutions faced unprecedented challenges. Amanda provided final updates as they prepared to disembark. The ceremony begins at 3 o'clock precisely. You'll be seated with the Secretary General and senior delegates. Your remarks come after the historical presentation but before the interfaith blessing. Sophie adjusted her scarlet Beulah dress, a choice that honored both British fashion and the gravity of the occasion, and prepared mentally for the transition from private contemplation to public service. The children's book from Sheffield remained in her briefcase, its messages of hope and understanding ready to inform whatever spontaneous moments might arise during the afternoon. The car door opened, and Sophie stepped into the crisp January air, immediately aware of the cameras, the waiting dignitaries, and the weight of history that surrounded Methodist Central Hall. Behind her lay a morning of authentic human connection in Sheffield, ahead waited an afternoon of diplomatic ceremony in Westminster. Her challenge was to bridge those worlds authentically, bringing the genuine warmth and understanding she had experienced in Yorkshire to the formal protocols of international diplomacy. The journey from Sheffield to Westminster was complete, but the most important part of her day was just beginning. The interior of Methodist Central Hall, Westminster, breathed with the weight of 8 decades of history as Sophie crossed its threshold. The Grand Hall, with its soaring dome and ornate galleries, had been carefully prepared for this momentous occasion. Delegates from 193 nations filled the main floor, their diverse attire creating a living tapestry of global representation that would have been unimaginable to the original 51 founding members who had gathered here in 1946. Sophie's arrival created a subtle ripple of attention throughout the assembled crowd. As the representative of King Charles III, her presence carried the symbolic weight of Britain's complex relationship with the United Nations, founding member, Permanent Security Council seat, former colonial power grappling with contemporary realities, and constitutional monarchy navigating republican international structures. Every gesture, every word, every moment of interaction would be scrutinized for diplomatic significance. Antonio Guterres approached her with the practiced ease of someone who had spent decades in international diplomacy. The Secretary General's Portuguese warmth combined with his profound understanding of global complexities made him an ideal counterpart for this historic ceremony. His greeting to Sophie carried both personal respect and institutional courtesy, establishing the tone for their shared platform duties. "Your Royal Highness, welcome to this celebration of enduring hope," Guterres said, his accented English lending gravitas to the formal exchange. "Your presence here honors not only the United Nations but the principles of international cooperation that your country helped establish." Sophie's response was carefully measured but genuinely felt. "Secretary General, it is an honor to represent His Majesty at such a significant moment. The work begun in this very hall 80 years ago remains as vital today as it was then, perhaps more so." The brief exchange, witnessed by delegates and media representatives, established the ceremonial framework while hinting at the deeper challenges that would be addressed throughout the afternoon. Sophie understood that her role extended beyond mere representation. She was participating in a collective affirmation of faith in multilateral institutions at a time when such faith was under enormous pressure. The ceremony began with a historical presentation that transported the audience back to January 10, 1946, when world leaders had gathered in this same space with hopes of preventing future global conflicts. Archival footage showed the earnest faces of delegates who had witnessed the devastating costs of World War and were determined to create mechanisms for peaceful conflict resolution. The black and white images seemed to blur the boundaries between past and present, emphasizing the continuity of human aspiration across generations. Sophie found herself particularly moved by footage of the British delegation in 1946, led by figures who had guided the country through its darkest hours while maintaining faith in international cooperation. The parallel to her own presence, representing a constitutional monarchy in an organization dominated by republics, speaking for tradition in a forum dedicated to progress, struck her as profoundly meaningful. When her turn came to address the assembly, Sophie rose with the confidence that came from decades of public speaking experience combined with genuine conviction about her message. The scarlet Beulah dress that had drawn attention throughout the day now seemed perfectly suited to the grandeur of the moment, its bold colors standing out against the formal backdrop while maintaining appropriate dignity. Her remarks began with acknowledgement of the venue's unique significance. "We gather today in the birthplace of the United Nations, where visionary leaders chose hope over despair, cooperation over conflict, and shared humanity over destructive nationalism. The words, carefully crafted but delivered with authentic emotion, established both historical context and contemporary relevance. Sophie's speech wove together themes from her morning in Sheffield with the broader diplomatic challenges facing the international community. Without explicitly referencing the children's book in her briefcase, she drew upon its messages of understanding and connection to argue for renewed commitment to the UN's founding principles. 8 decades ago, representatives of 51 nations sat where you sit today, united in their determination to build a better world, she continued. They understood that lasting peace required more than the absence of war. It demanded active cultivation of understanding, respect, and cooperation across all the boundaries that might divide us. The audience listened with the attention that such occasions demanded, but Sophie sensed genuine engagement beyond diplomatic courtesy. Her words carried the authority of representing a founding member nation while acknowledging the challenges that had complicated the UN's evolution. The balance between celebration and realism reflected her understanding that commemorative ceremonies must speak to current realities rather than simply honoring past achievements. As she spoke about the importance of including all voices in global decision-making, Sophie's thoughts returned to 8-year-old Jamie at Sparkle Sheffield, whose digital artwork had captured essential truths about peace and understanding. The connection between a boy with autism creating art in Yorkshire and delegates from around the world gathered in Westminster felt profound rather than contrived. Both represented humanity's capacity for communication across differences. The ceremony's interfaith component brought additional depth to the afternoon's significance. Religious leaders representing multiple traditions offered blessings and prayers that acknowledged both divine inspiration and human responsibility in the work of building peaceful societies. Sophie participated respectfully in each element, understanding that her presence validated the inclusive approach that had characterized Britain's relationship with global institutions. During the networking reception that followed the formal ceremony, Sophie engaged in dozens of brief but meaningful conversations with delegates representing every continent and most nations. These interactions, carefully managed by protocol officers but informed by genuine curiosity, provided insights into contemporary challenges facing the international community. The ambassador from Bangladesh spoke passionately about climate change's disproportionate impact on developing nations, while the delegate from Norway emphasized his country's continued commitment to peacekeeping operations. A representative from Uruguay shared stories of regional cooperation in South America, and the ambassador from Ghana described innovative approaches to sustainable development that could serve as models for other African nations. Each conversation reminded Sophie of the human faces behind diplomatic abstractions, the real communities and individuals whose lives were affected by decisions made in forums like this one. The parallel to her morning work in Sheffield, where individual children represented broader challenges and opportunities, reinforced her conviction that effective diplomacy required understanding both global systems and local realities. The afternoon's most poignant moment came during a special presentation of the UN's evolution through 8 decades. As images flashed across screens showing the organization's response to everything from natural disasters to armed conflicts, from health pandemics to refugee crises, the scope of human suffering and resilience became overwhelming. Sophie found herself thinking not just about the institutional achievements being celebrated but about the millions of individual lives that had been touched by the UN's work. When Secretary-General Guterres delivered the ceremony's concluding remarks, his words carried both gratitude for past achievements and urgency about future challenges. Climate change, global inequality, technological disruption, and persistent conflicts demanded responses that no single nation could provide alone. The United Nations, despite its flaws and limitations, remained humanity's best hope for coordinated action on issues that transcended national boundaries. 8 decades ago, our predecessors chose multilateralism over isolation, cooperation over competition, hope over despair, Guterres declared. Today, we must make that choice again, understanding that our interconnected world faces challenges that require our most creative and committed collaboration. As the ceremony concluded and delegates began their various departures, Sophie carried with her a deep sense of having participated in something historically significant. The Methodist Central Hall had once again served as a venue for international commitment to shared values and common purpose. Her role in representing British continuity with that tradition felt both humbling and inspiring. The return journey to Windsor would provide time for reflection on a day that had bridged Sheffield's authentic community engagement with Westminster's formal diplomacy. Both experiences had reinforced her understanding that meaningful service, whether royal or international, required genuine connection with the people and principles being served. The royal car pulled away from Methodist Central Hall as the January twilight painted Westminster in shades of gold and purple. Sophie settled back into her seat, the weight of the afternoon ceremony still palpable in her shoulders and heart. The children's book from Sheffield lay open on her lap, its bright illustrations providing a stark contrast to the formal documents and diplomatic briefings scattered around her. As London's evening traffic created its familiar symphony outside the bulletproof windows, she found herself processing the extraordinary journey from Yorkshire's authentic community connections to the grand halls of international diplomacy. Amanda Richardson sat quietly across from her, recognizing the contemplative mood that always followed significant royal engagements. After 15 years of working with the Duchess, she had learned to distinguish between the exhaustion that came from mere duty fulfillment and the energized reflection that followed truly meaningful service. Today clearly fell into the latter category, despite its demanding schedule and emotional intensity. The Secretary General's staff were particularly impressed, Amanda offered during a brief lull in traffic. His aide mentioned that your remarks struck exactly the right tone, celebratory but realistic, honoring history while acknowledging current challenges. Sophie nodded absently, her attention divided between the diplomatic feedback and the deeper personal impact of the day's experiences. The formal aspects of royal service, the speeches, the ceremonies, the carefully choreographed interactions, formed only part of what made such occasions meaningful. The real significance lay in the connections forged, the understanding deepened, and the inspiration drawn from witnessing human resilience and cooperation across all kinds of boundaries. As they crossed Westminster Bridge, the Thames flowing darkly beneath them, Sophie's thoughts returned to the remarkable contrast between her morning in Sheffield and her afternoon in Westminster. Both experiences had involved bringing people together across differences, but the contexts couldn't have been more different. In Sheffield, the connections were intimate and immediate, a boy with autism sharing his artwork, teenagers learning social skills, Olympic champions encouraging young athletes. In Westminster, the connections were formal and symbolic, 193 nations reaffirming their commitment to international cooperation, diplomats speaking carefully crafted words about shared values. Yet both experiences had reinforced her understanding of service as fundamentally about facilitating connection and understanding between people who might otherwise remain strangers to each other. Whether helping children with autism find their voices or representing British values on the international stage, the essential work remained the same: building bridges across the gaps that separated individuals and communities. Her mobile phone buzzed softly with a message from King Charles, who had been following the day's events from Windsor despite his minor illness. "Magnificently done," the text read. "The coverage has been universally positive, but, more importantly, you represented our values with perfect grace and authenticity." The monarch's approval meant everything to Sophie, particularly given the increasing responsibilities he had been placing on her and Edward as senior working royals. The media response to the day's activities was already becoming visible on social platforms and news websites. Images of Sophie in her scarlet dress addressing the UN ceremony were being shared alongside photos from her Sheffield visits, creating a visual narrative of royal service that spanned from community charities to international diplomacy. The contrast seemed to capture something essential about modern monarchy: its capacity to operate authentically across an enormous range of contexts and constituencies. But it was the responses from ordinary citizens that touched Sophie most deeply. Messages were already appearing on the royal family's social media accounts from parents of children with autism who had seen coverage of her Sheffield visit, from skating fans who appreciated her engagement with the European Championships, and from people around the world who had watched the UN ceremony and felt renewed hope for international cooperation. One message, from a teacher in Newcastle, particularly moved her: "My daughter has autism, and seeing you take time to really listen to those children means everything to our family." She watched the coverage and said, "The princess understands that we're important too." The simple words captured exactly why Sophie had chosen to maintain her extensive charity portfolio despite the increasing demands of representing the crown in formal diplomatic settings. As the car turned onto the M4 motorway for the final stretch to Windsor, Sophie opened the children's book once more, studying Jamie's artwork with fresh appreciation. The boy's rendering of the United Nations building, surrounded by children holding hands around the globe, seemed prophetic in light of the afternoon ceremony. His message, "Peace starts with understanding," had proven to be the perfect thesis for a day that had demonstrated how understanding could be built through patient attention to individual stories and needs. The European Figure Skating Championships would continue in Sheffield for several more days, bringing together athletes from dozens of countries in the kind of positive international competition that represented the UN's highest aspirations. The young skaters she had met would pursue their dreams with the dedication and grace that made sport such a powerful force for global connection. Their partnership, like the international partnerships celebrated at Westminster, required trust, communication, and shared commitment to excellence. Prince Edward would return to Sheffield for the championship's conclusion, maintaining the royal family's presence at an event that showcased Britain's capacity to host world-class international gatherings. Their coordinated approach to such responsibilities reflected years of experience in dividing royal duties effectively, ensuring that important occasions received appropriate attention without overwhelming any single member of the family. The evening's quiet would provide opportunity for deeper reflection on the day's significance. Sophie had represented King Charles and the British monarchy at one of the most important commemorative ceremonies of the year, standing alongside world leaders to celebrate 8 decades of international cooperation despite enormous challenges. Her role in that ceremony would be remembered as part of the historical record, documented in archives and diplomatic reports that would be consulted by future historians studying this era. But the lasting impact of the day would be found in smaller moments, in Jamie's artwork now sitting in her briefcase, in the confidence gained by teenagers with autism who had seen their experiences validated by royal attention, in the renewed faith felt by delegates who had participated in a ceremony that celebrated humanity's persistent hope for peaceful cooperation. As Windsor Castle appeared in the distance, its ancient towers illuminated against the evening sky, Sophie felt profound gratitude for the opportunity to serve in such a varied and meaningful way. The contrast between Sheffield's community connections and Westminster's diplomatic grandeur hadn't diminished either experience, instead, it had highlighted the essential unity underlying all forms of authentic service. The car passed through the castle's gates just as the evening news was beginning to broadcast reports of the UN anniversary ceremony. Sophie's remarks would be analyzed by diplomatic correspondents, her appearance scrutinized by fashion commentators, and her performance evaluated by royal watchers around the world. But, for her, the day's meaning lay in the accumulated moments of genuine connection with children who had been overlooked by society, with athletes pursuing excellence against all odds, with diplomats maintaining faith in international cooperation despite countless disappointments. Tomorrow would bring new responsibilities, different challenges, and fresh opportunities to serve. But tonight, as she prepared to join King Charles for a quiet dinner at Windsor, Sophie carried with her the deep satisfaction that came from knowing that royal service, at its best, could touch lives and inspire hope in ways both intimate and global. The children's book from Sheffield would indeed sit on her desk, as she had promised, serving as a daily reminder that the most important diplomacy often happened in the smallest spaces, between the most vulnerable people, where understanding could bloom into hope and hope could grow into positive change. The day that had begun before dawn with frost on the windows of Bagshot Park had ended with the warm glow of service well rendered and connections authentically made. In the gentle quiet of Windsor's ancient walls, surrounded by centuries of royal history, Sophie understood more clearly than ever that her role in that history would be measured not by the grandeur of the ceremony she attended but by the quality of attention she brought to each person she encountered along the way. It had been, by any measure, a day that would be remembered, and one that had left the world, in small but significant ways, a little bit better than it had been that morning.